Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're looking at one of the most incredible and honestly tragic historical ironies of the 20th century. It's a story that still completely defines how we view global conflict today. We're going to explore how two entirely different global superpowers, decades apart, marched into the exact same jungle, fought the identical enemy, and somehow made the exact same fatal strategic mistakes.
Okay, let's dive right into this. We're looking at a deeply fascinating mirror structure in history here. We'll examine how the catastrophic fall of French colonialism in Southeast Asia, well, it didn't serve as a warning. Instead, it directly laid the groundwork for an identical American disaster just a few years later. But to really understand how two military titans fell, we've got to start at the very beginning.
Part 1. The Fall of French Indochina and a History of Resistance. It's absolutely crucial to realize that for the Vietnamese, the French were really just the latest in a very, very long line of foreign occupiers. Resistance is practically woven into the national identity, going all the way back to 111 BCE with the Chinese Han Dynasty conquest, right through the formation of French Indochina in 1887, and then the brutal Japanese occupation during World War II. By the time the French tried to reassert their colonial grip in 1946, which sparked the First Indochina War, the Vietnamese Communist Viet Minh forces, led by Ho Chi Minh, had been honing their survival and resistance skills for generations. So fast forward to the early 1950s, and the French are just hopelessly bogged down.
Part 2. The Trap at Dien Bien Phu and the Hubris of Conventional Warfare. So desperate to force a decisive victory, French General Henri Navarre devised this really bold plan in 1953. The idea: lure the elusive Viet Minh into an open, pitched battle by parachuting thousands of troops into an isolated valley called Dien Bien Phu. It was the ultimate clash of military doctrines. Navarre just assumed his rigidly modern approach, relying on airdrops, M24 Chaffee tanks, massive defensive bases, would easily crush the enemy. But he was facing the highly adaptable Vietnamese guerrilla tactics perfected by General Vo Nguyen Giap. We're talking forces that relied on underground tunnels, hit-and-run ambushes, masterful jungle camouflage. Navarre fundamentally misunderstood who he was fighting.
And nothing captures this dramatic arrogance better than French Colonel Charles Perroth, the commander of artillery at Dien Bien Phu. He famously boasted that his counter-battery fire was so superior, no enemy gun would fire 3 rounds without being destroyed. He just flat out assumed the Viet Minh couldn't possibly maneuver heavy weapons through that dense, mountainous jungle. No way, right?
But the reality on the ground? It was a shocking inversion. The French garrison sat at the bottom of the valley with roughly 15,000 troops and 60 artillery guns. But unbeknownst to them, General Giap had mobilized a massive hidden army of 50,000 troops. And even more staggering than that, tens of thousands of laborers had secretly dragged 240 heavy artillery pieces up the sheer, jungle-covered mountains overlooking the French base. It's like a giant puzzle they solved right under the French's noses. Giap had completely flipped the track.
What followed was 56 days of absolute hell. Starting in March 1954, Giap's hidden artillery rained relentless fire down on the valley, instantly destroying the airstrip and trapping the French. It completely devolved into a brutal, muddy trench war. Colonel Perroth, realizing his tragic miscalculation, he actually took his own life early in the battle. After 56 days of a suffocating siege, the French forces were annihilated, and France's will to fight was entirely broken.
Part 3. A Nation Divided in Two and the Geneva Pivot.
That devastating French defeat at Dien Bien Phu forced them straight to the negotiating table in Switzerland. The 1954 Geneva Accords officially ended French colonial rule, but it left a fractured nation. The agreement created the 17th parallel, which was a provisional line dividing the country into a communist north led by Ho Chi Minh and a pro-Western south. Now, this split was intended to be totally temporary, pending nationwide elections in 1956. But those elections never happened. Instead, this fragile little line drawn on a map simply sowed the seeds for an even larger, far more devastating conflict.
Which brings us to the pivotal question of this explainer. With the French utterly defeated by guerrilla tactics and a highly adaptable enemy, would the United States, the next global superpower to step into the ring, actually learn from the mistakes they had just witnessed?
Part 4. The American Domino Theory and Stepping into the Quagmire.
Now, we have to remember, the United States didn't enter Vietnam to build a colony like the French. Their entrance was driven by the intense geopolitical anxieties of the Cold War. The core justification? The domino theory.
Coined by President Eisenhower, this was a deeply held belief in Washington that if one nation in Southeast Asia fell to Soviet and Chinese communist influence, well, the surrounding nations, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and beyond, would just topple one after another like dominoes. Driven by this fear of global communist expansion, America stepped in to fund, and eventually fight, the exact same enemy the French had just lost to.
The escalation that followed was staggering. From roughly 18,000 military advisors under President Kennedy in 1961, the numbers swelled to 200,000 troops in 1965 and topped 500,000 American soldiers by 1968. The U.S. military machine was just pouring into the jungle. But, much like General Navarre, American commanders mistakenly believed that overwhelming conventional strength, massive troop numbers, and superior technology would somehow guarantee victory in a guerrilla landscape.
A prime example of this strategy was Operation Rolling Thunder. The U.S. unleashed a massive 3-year aerial bombing campaign over North Vietnam, dropping literally unprecedented payloads to destroy supply routes and force Ho Chi Minh to surrender. But what actually happened? The North Vietnamese simply adapted. They repaired roads overnight and moved their entire logistics networks, hospitals, and barracks deep underground into vast, incredibly complex tunnel systems. Conventional firepower was, once again, completely missing the mark.
Part 5. Repeating history's fatal mistakes and the Tet Offensive.
If Dien Bien Phu was the fatal shock to the French, well, the Tet Offensive was the exact mirror moment for the Americans. In January 1968, right during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, which was a time when a ceasefire was traditionally observed, General Giap orchestrated a stunning, massive surprise attack. 85,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops simultaneously struck over 100 cities and military bases across South Vietnam. They even breached the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The American military, much like the French at Dien Bien Phu, was caught entirely off guard by the sheer scale and coordination of the enemy. Now, strictly militarily speaking, the Tet Offensive was actually a massive defeat for the North Vietnamese. They lost tens of thousands of fighters and held almost no territory. But strategically, it was a masterpiece. This shift is perfectly captured by Walter Cronkite, who was the most trusted journalist in America at the time. When he declared on national television that the war would end in a stalemate, it signaled a profound turning point. The Tet Offensive entirely won the psychological war, instantly shattering American public support and the illusion that victory was just around the corner.
When we zoom out, you can clearly see the exact mirrored steps of failure shared by both superpowers. Step 1. March in relying on overwhelming conventional firepower and massed bases. Step 2. Tragically underestimate the enemy's incredible adaptability, logistics, and sheer willpower. And Step 3. Suffer a shocking, highly publicized blow that completely destroys public support and political will back home. It's a perfect, tragic loop.
And as we compare their final exits, the echoes are undeniable. The French suffered a total tactical military collapse at Dien Bien Phu and were forced to withdraw immediately. The Americans never actually lost a major pitched battle in the field, but they entirely lost the political will to fight after the psychological shock of the Tet Offensive, leading to a long, really painful withdrawal. The tactical outcomes were different, for sure, but the fundamental strategic failure to understand the nature of the enemy and the terrain, that was identical. Which leaves us with this final, vital question to ponder. We've seen how two of the most technologically advanced and well-funded military machines in human history were dismantled by a determined, highly adaptable local resistance. If immense firepower cannot guarantee victory against an enemy fighting for their own soil, what does that mean for the limits of conventional power in the future of global warfare? Think about that, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.